Okay, so chapter 20 is all about phylogenies and how they represent the history of life. So a phylogeny is an evolutionary tree, an evolutionary history of really one organism, or you're really tracking the ancestors of one organism. So an evolutionary tree in a similar way to how what you would call your family tree, except it goes past, just relatives. It goes into other species. What species came before? And so these are your study objectives. There's a certain amount of terminology. We're going to look at how a cladogram, which is really kind of a simple evolutionary tree, would be constructed. And then you'll have to interpret an evolutionary tree. And we'll talk about why these are always considered hypothetical. It's just a hypothesis. However, it's a hypothesis built on lots of information and data. So it's not a hypothesis in the slang sense of the word. It's a hypothesis in the more scientific sense of the word. So it's something that has data underneath it. And talk about how data can be misinterpreted, talk about how missing data, sometimes you don't have all the data, so you always know that that's part of the deal. That new data can be discovered and that can then be added, and that might change the tree a little bit. We're going to look at the rule of parsimony, which is also called Occam's razor, OCCAM, if you want to look it up. And we'll talk about some other terminology and some other hypotheses on how what might have happened in the early, when life was just very simple on Earth, how different cell types may have formed. Not how life began, but how, because we really have no clue, but how some of the, how the prokaryotes and the eukaryotes might be related. Okay, so a phylogeny is really an evolutionary tree. The definition is it's a hypothesis about the patterns of relationship among species. And these are different ways that we can try to express the relationships. A rooted or an unrooted phylogenetic tree. We're going to tend to use the rooted style. And you can see it implies that there is one common ancestor, which is the root. You might think of it as the trunk of the tree, but it's called the root of the tree, represents maybe the common ancestral group. And then that split or diverged into two groups, and then those split and diverged into multiple groups. So ultimately you end up with, at the tips of the branches, that represents specific groups. In this tree, it's still pretty generic, like all animals are included right here in the star. But it gives you a concept of the relationships. Now, Darwin drew things like this in his notebook. This is one of the most famous pages of his notebook. He writes the words, "I think," and then he draws what seems to be an evolutionary tree with the number 1, probably representing the root. And then the tips of the branches representing different modern groups of organisms. So even Darwin envisioned that all species came from some common ancestor. And we're not talking about one single organism. We mean like one group of organisms, one population. But if you really reverse the concept of cell theory, you may remember that cell theory states that all cells come from other cells by cell division. And that cell division can be mitosis or it can be meiosis. But if you reverse, if you take all modern organisms that are on Earth today and you sort of turn the wheels of time in reverse so that the cells, instead of dividing, are fusing back together, then if you follow that logic all the way back, it means that there must have been one original cell that all cells eventually arose from or are descended from. Now, we don't know if it was just one or it could have been a couple, but it gets you to a point where there has to be just a few cells. And so now how those cells first formed, no idea. So evolution does not include a description of how life first began, how the first cells actually formed. But what we're talking about is after there were some cells, then we can conceptualize how cell division took us from that point. So that would be the number 1 on this picture to modern day, which would be the letters A, B, C, D, for example. All right, a little bit of terminology. I think I already mentioned the starting point, or the most distant ancestor, I guess, on a tree is typically represented at the root, which is like the trunk, but we call it the root of the tree. That's the starting point of the tree. And then when that group of organisms diverged into different species, there's a split. So the branch point, the split point, is sometimes called the node, N-O-D-E. Oops. Let me get my pen here. Nope. There we go. So node. So the node would be the point like right here, and that point would represent some common ancestor just right before it broke into 2 groups. So there would be a node here. Anywhere there's a branch point, there's a node. That is the same thing. All right. Now, things that are, like, let's say you have a species A and a species B over here, and then a species C. I don't know. But A and B are going to be, this tree is implying that A and B, the information must have been interpreted to mean that A and B are more closely related to each other than they are to species C. They're all related, but A and B are more closely related. So we're really talking about what's more closely related to each other than some other species. So, of course, everything is related based on what I just said on the last slide about all things come from just 1 or 2 cells or a few cells. So we consider all things to be related to each other, but how closely related is what we're really looking at. So A and B, since they have a branch point, since they share a common ancestor, you don't have to go back very far in time, because when you go back on the tree, you're going back in time conceptually. So when you go back in time, there must have been a common ancestor relatively recently, because the distance here is short. When you go back further, here's an ancestor that would be common to A and B and C. But you have to go back further to get to that point. So A and B are more closely related to each other than A is related to C. Or A and B are more closely related to each other than B is related to C. So C is a more distant relative because the branch point, the node, the common ancestor for any of these groups, you look at how far back on the tree you have to go before you reach that meeting point. And so that's really important concept in interpreting evolutionary trees or phylogenetic trees. I don't tend to use the term sister taxa, but it just means closely related groups. I also don't tend to use the term polytomy. It means more than two closely related groups. But one term I do use is this, basal taxon. A basal taxon is a group, it represents the group that's at the end of this branch, and it's most, of everything in the tree, it's more similar to the whatever the ancestor is at the root, because it branched off early, and so it's more simple. It's more, probably doesn't have a lot of, it's probably looks visually, it's a modern organism because it's at the end of the branch, but because it branched off early from the root in this tree, it means it probably gives us an idea of what the root, the group that is the ancestor of the entire tree, might have looked like, because that organism is gone. So you have a group that is most similar to the ancestor of the entire tree. It gives you kind of a concept of what that root ancestor might have been like. So basal taxon, it's the modern group that might be most similar to the ancestor that's now gone. Okay, some more terminology. And these terms are completely relative, just like, and that's no pun intended. Relative meaning you have to define what groups you're comparing. Like on the last slide, I said A and B are more closely related to each other than they are to C. But A and C are more closely related to each other than they are to D, for example. So A and C have a node here, and in order to find a node with D, you have to go further back. And so therefore A and C are more closely related than they are to D. So you have to know, like, what are the groups that are being compared? Because these are relative terms. It's like saying I'm taller than my sister but shorter than my brother. Well, those terms, taller and shorter, those are comparative. So you have to define who are you comparing to. Because you're not just shorter, period. You're shorter than your brother, but you're taller than your sister. So there has to be a defined comparison that's being done. You're not just taller as a characteristic. You're taller in comparison. So these terms are very relative in that sense too. So when you're comparing groups or looking at groups on an evolutionary tree, or what we call a cladogram really focuses on physical structures, comparisons of physical structures. So it's an evolutionary tree, but it takes into account just some very simple data. But a cladogram is, when it's constructed, you look at similar structures, and typically you would assume that groups that have more similar structures when compared to each other are more closely related to each other, and groups of organisms that are much more different are probably more distantly related to that group. So we have these terms, a derived trait and an ancestral trait. A derived trait, and these are physical things, or sometimes called character, but it's a phenotype. Something that can be observed. A derived trait is something that different groups have in common. So it's a similarity or a trait that groups have in common, and they have it in common because they both inherited it from a recent common ancestor. So like group A and group B both might have a trait in common because the ancestor that they share had that trait, and they both inherited it from that common ancestor. And that isn't the full definition, though, because a derived trait has to define the clade. A clade is a group, so a clade could be a species, it could be a genus, it could be a family, order, a class, a phylum, or a kingdom, or a domain. And it has to be the defining feature of the clade, typically. So it's so if you have, I'm going to show you on the next slide an example, but you know, mammals all have hair, fur, and we make milk with mammary glands. And so for all the mammals, the reason all mammals have that is because we all came from a common ancestral mammal that had that. And those are the traits that define the group. So that's the derived trait of mammals. So it's really the defining trait, derived trait of mammals. Sorry about my handwriting. Is fur and mammary glands. I'm just going to write milk, but you know what I mean. Okay, so those traits define the mammals. So those are the derived traits of mammals. And all mammals have those because they all come from one node on the evolutionary tree when those adaptations first appeared. And then from that point, that original group of mammals diversified into all kinds of different species, but we all have fur and milk because our common ancestor mammal, the first group that was called mammals, had those adaptations. So those are the derived traits. Ancestral traits, we would use that term for things that everybody in the group has, but only because they all came from an ancestor that's much more distant. So all mammals have fur and milk, and those are the derived traits of mammals, but all mammals also have 4 legs. But 4 legs came long before fur and milk. And so we're tetrapods, but so are reptiles are tetrapods, and so are amphibians are also tetrapods. So an ancestral trait is something that came long before. It doesn't define the group specifically, but it is a trait that they all share. So I'm going to give you an example on the next slide. So we're going to construct a cladogram. I'm going to show you how to use the data to construct a cladogram. It doesn't matter how the chart is set up, but this data has to be given to you. And so these are animals on this side of the grid here. And these are traits or adaptations up here. So you may not have heard of all these things, but you probably heard of a fish and a frog and a lizard and a rabbit. Lancelet and lamprey you'll learn later. But it doesn't really matter what these are. But these are the names of the organisms. And then these are the traits. Now sometimes the traits are listed on the left side and the animals are listed on the top. That doesn't matter. Okay. Now if there's a 0 in the box, that means that animal does not have that trait. So lancelet does not have a vertebral column. But lamprey does have a vertebral column. Lancelet does not have a hinged jaw, but lamprey does not have a hinged jaw. And so you can see, I've set up this chart so that it's pretty logical. You can see kind of a pattern here. I did that on purpose so that you can kind of see how this is done the first time. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, if I'm going to make a cladogram, I'm going to make mine that goes from, I usually make mine that go left to right. So first start with your root. Draw your root. And at the root, just put ancestor. So the ancestor of everything on this list. So the common ancestor of everything on this list is at the root. Okay, you don't have to put, you don't know what that is, but just put common ancestor and then draw a root. All right, now, then it's going to split, right? Because that's what they do. Okay, Now, lancelet doesn't have any of the traits on this list. So the common ancestor was a long time ago, and lancelet is a modern organism. But lancelet branches off very early in our tree. And so that's going to be the basal taxon, actually. That's the group that's probably most similar to what that common ancestor was like. Lancelet's a modern organism. But it probably gives us an idea because it doesn't really have a lot of changes, a lot of adaptations from what that common ancestor had. So that's probably that's going to represent our basal taxon. Now, everything else on the chart has at least one or more of these traits, meaning there are changes that happened in the tree over time that led to these different organisms. So the first change that happened is going to be the one that most or all of the organisms have. So look for, like, what trait? Do most of the animals have hair? No. Do most of them have an amniotic egg? No. So look for the one that most of them have, and that's going to be the trait that goes early on the tree. So you mark the trait on the tree, not at the node, because the node represents a group of organisms, but you mark the trait as sort of a point that the organisms go through on this path. And so vertebral column, I'm just going to put VC. Now, lancelet did not pass through VC, so you have to put VC after this node. But this branch goes through VC, and that means that all of these animals got that because this branch of the tree got that. You're thinking about time going from early, this is early in time, and over here, ... this is present day. Okay, so this is kind of like the path through time. So the group of animals that got the vertebral column are the group that passed through this part of the line on the tree on their way to the present day. So lamprey got vertebral column, and then it didn't get anything else. So at that point, you can kind of branch off another split, and that's going to be lamprey. I'm going to run out of space, aren't I? Okay, so from the common ancestor, if we follow the path to lamprey, lamprey picks up a vertebral column, and then that's it. Just kind of trace it. Okay, what's next? Fish. Fish pick up a vertebral column, and the next trait is going to be hinged jaw. So put hinged jaw here after the node that splits off to lamprey, because lamprey doesn't get a hinged jaw, but everything else does. So go HJ. And then split off this group and do fish. This is modern day fish. So modern day fish have a vertebral column, a hinged jaw, and then it goes, and then you follow the path. All right. Now, after hinged jaw, what comes next? Legs. There's three groups that have legs, so that comes next, legs. And then frog has vertebral column, hinged jaw, and legs, and that's it. So split him off and do legs. The next trait would be amniotic egg, AE. And then split this off. So AE, amniotic egg, follow this path up here, that goes to lizard. And then on this very last branch, hair. I could have put milk, but I could have said fur, really, but hair, fine. Okay, so that's mammals. Oh no, rabbit is a mammal. Okay, so this one had particular animals. You could have like just the whole group, mammals, reptiles, fish. All right. Oh, why did I write legs there? I meant to write frog. Sorry. Some of you probably noticed that. Frog. not legs. So the traits have to be picked up on the path. The traits have to be marked on the tree. And then the modern organisms have to line up at present day. And when you follow the path from the common ancestor to the modern organism, whatever traits you pass through, those would be the traits that the organism has. So it's a little trial and error. It's kind of a logic problem, but it's, you know, if you have done it correctly, because you can trace out each path and double check that you've drawn it correctly. So that's how you would draw a cladogram. Now this one when I set this up, I did it really nicely because I put the traits in the order in which they're going to be appearing on the tree. So I did that. I could have just scrambled these up. I could have had hair over here and legs down here, but I wanted you to kind of see the pattern here. Okay, but when you're doing it, you're looking for what trait do most of the groups have. Those come earlier on the tree. What traits do only one or two groups have? Those come later on the tree. So, and then as you're drawing the paths, double check. And use pencil, not pen, because you might have to erase and readjust. Now this is the way your book draws this tree. I hate this picture. So I wrote, P.S. The tree they drew is terrible. I'll tell you why. So they have the traits in the right order: vertebral column, hinge jaw, legs, amniotic egg, hair. Okay, but then they do this yes-no thing. Don't do this. I want you to do it the way I showed you on the last slide. What they did is vertebral column, yes. So vertebral column here is related to this yes. And then they say hinge jaw, but this hinge jaw is related to this yes. So you see how it's kind of wonky? This legs is related to this yes. You have to really be paying attention. So instead of having yes, no, what I would do is instead of having this, instead of writing yes here, I would write vertebral column here. And then on this hinge jaw, yes, instead of putting yes, put hinge jaw here. Otherwise, it looks almost like when it says hinge jaw, your eye goes down and looks at this yes, no below it, and it'd be all screwed up. So anyway, don't do it this way. Just put the trait wherever it appears. If it's a no, then you don't have to say anything. That's like the default. Not getting a vertebral column is the same as the ancestor. That's just nothing happened on that branch of the tree. So only just put what did happen. Okay, so anyway, it's a terrible picture, but they end up coming up with virtually the same tree. Now my tree started with lancelet at the top of, I guess, on the far right. On my tree, I had lancelet at the top, then lamprey, and then fish. Theirs kind of moves up, mine moved down. It doesn't matter because you can draw it any direction you want, as long as when you trace out each path, you pick up the correct traits that organism has. Okay, so looking at this tree, I have a couple questions. All right, so let's do this. All right, I'm going to put VC here. Vertebral column is here. So this path falls through vertebral column. Hinge jaw is here. Legs are here. Amniotic egg is here. And hair is here. Okay, so let's look at it this way, and then this is the ancestor Common ancestor of everything is at the root. Okay, it says which organism is considered the outgroup in this cladogram? The outgroup is like the basal taxon. It's the group that doesn't have any new traits, so it looks much like the ancestor. So that's the lancelet. It really doesn't have anything. So think about basal taxon as another term that means the same thing. Sometimes we call it the outgroup. I don't know why. You guys know biology, doing well in biology is mostly understanding the terminology. If you understand the terminology, then a lot of the concepts aren't really that difficult. But there's a lot of words, a lot of vocabulary. All right, so I give you this sentence. Amniotes is a clade of organisms with the amniotic egg as the derived trait. So let's go to where amniotic egg is, right here. So which organisms are in this clade of amniotes? So any organism that has the amniotic egg is an amniote. So anything that passed through here. So what I would say is the groups that are called amniotes would be anything that has the amniotic egg. So it means anything that passes through this. So you look to the right, you see rabbit and lizard. So those would both be in the group called the amniotes. Almost like if you take a pair of scissors, if this was a real tree, that's pretty good, scissors, and you cut right here at the derived trait, whatever branches fall off, well, one branch falls off, but whatever's on the ends of those branches, that's in the group. So for the amniotes, you cut the tree conceptually, you cut it where the trait appears, and everything that falls when that branch is cut is part of that clade. So rabbit and lizard are in that clade. Okay. Another question. Is the presence of a hinged jaw, so remember hinged jaw is right here, derived or ancestral for the amniotes? So remember the amniotes are this group here. And remember the trait that is the defining trait of the amniotes is the amniotic egg. Usually the name of the clade is almost the same as the name of the derived trait. So is the hinged jaw derived or ancestral? Is this trait derived or ancestral with reference to this group? Well, we already know the derived trait is amniotic egg. So in this case, you have a little bit of inside information. But the derived trait is the trait that defines the group. So the amniotic egg is what defines the group. Hinged jaw came in an earlier ancestor, so that would be called ancestral. So the amniotic egg is derived for these guys, and hinged jaw is ancestral for these guys. Okay, let's do another one. Let's do legs. So 4 legs. The group that has 4 legs are called the tetrapods. So the derived trait of the tetrapods is 4 legs. So if you cut here, 4 legs, this is your group. These are the tetrapods. All right? And so for the tetrapods, which would be in this drawing, rabbit, lizard, frog, 4 legs is derived. And then what trait could you name that would be ancestral? Ancestral means came before, so you got to go back in time, go earlier on the tree. So an ancestral trait for the tetrapods, you could say hinged jaw, that would be correct. You could say vertebral column, that would be correct. It has to be something that came before, but not the trait that is the defining trait of the group. All right, so tetrapods, 4 legs is the derived trait, hinged jaw and vertebral column are ancestral. All right, so you're always looking either at the group itself or something that came earlier. Derived is what defines the group itself. Ancestral is something that came in an earlier stage. So like fish have a hinged jaw, but they're not tetrapods. All right. So the derived trait, all the organisms in the group have to have that. For the ancestral trait, they all have it, and there's other groups of animals that also have that ancestral trait. All right, so we have a little practice here. All right, I'm going to take a break, and there'll be another lecture segment that we're going to start with this tree. It's a little more complex, but it's already made up for you, so you're just reading the data, reading the information.